She was reaching for her chest when Wren held up the watch. I saw it happen from 6 feet away. The specific gesture of a person touching something that is always there and finding it gone. The hand going to the chest and the fingers closing on absence, and the fraction of a second where the mind catches up to what the hand already knows. Catherine Bowen had been standing at the overlook above the Laurel Mountain trail in Pisgah National Forest, with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and her eyes closed, and she had turned when she heard my daughter's voice, and Wren was holding the watch on its broken chain with both hands the way she held things she considered important. Wren said, "Is this yours? We found it on the ground." Catherine looked at the watch. She reached for it. She took it from Wren's hands and closed her fingers around it and held it the way she had been holding it for 2 years. Tightly, with the specific controlled pressure of someone holding something they know the cost of losing. She said, "Where?" Wren said, "Down there, in the leaves. The chain must have broken." Catherine looked at me. I was in trail clothes, in the specific way of someone who was comfortable in this forest rather than merely present in it. I said, "A hiker coming down described the woman who dropped it. We moved up fast." She said, "Thank you." She was 51 years old, and she had the quality of someone who had been managing something difficult for a long time, and who had developed, in the managing of it, a specific composure that was not coldness, but was the discipline of a person who had decided that composure was what she owed the world on the days when the world required her presence. She was turning back to the overlook when I said, "There's something else." She turned. I said, "I was on this trail 2 years ago, October 2021. Catherine Bowen went still. I said, "I found a man who had collapsed on the Laurel Mountain connector. I performed CPR for 14 minutes until the paramedics arrived. Before they arrived, before I had any information about who he was, he said something." She said, "What did he say?" I said, "He said, 'Find her.' Those were the only words." She looked at me. She looked at the watch in her closed hand. Wren said, "Daddy said, 'Find her.' That's what the man on the trail told him. Daddy's been trying to find you for 2 years." Catherine Bowen looked at my daughter. She looked at me. Something moved across her face that was not composure and was not its absence. Something more specific than either of those things. Something I did not have a name for and that she apparently did not need to name because she knew what it was. She said, "You were with him." I said, "Yes." She said, "He wasn't alone." I said, "No, he was not alone." She closed her eyes. The overlook was quiet around us. Pisgah in September. The specific quality of a North Carolina mountain morning when the summer has started to release its grip, and the light is beginning to think about what autumn is going to require of it. The trees below us were still mostly green with the first suggestions of what was coming. I had been on this trail many times in 2 years. I had been waiting for this morning for all of them. I want to tell you about the morning I found Robert Bowen on the Laurel Mountain Connector Trail. But to tell you that I have to tell you about Sarah, and to tell you about Sarah, I have to start in West Asheville, which is where I have lived my whole life, and where the specific quality of a place that holds you without demanding anything from you in return is something I have been grateful for in the years since she died. I grew up in West Asheville. My father had died when I was 11, a construction accident, the year before Nora found work enough to keep the house, and she had raised my sister and me alone from that point, in a house 4 blocks from the French Broad River, in the specific way of Asheville families that had been there long enough that the city's changes were the background of their lives rather than the reason for them. I had gone to UNC Asheville and studied outdoor education and had come back to Asheville after graduation and had built a career as a freelance trail guide and outdoor educator, leading hikes, running wilderness programs for schools and community organizations, teaching the specific curriculum of attention to the natural world that I had absorbed growing up in the mountains, and that I believed was one of the more important things a person could learn. It was not a wealthy career. It was sufficient. I had been doing it for 16 years by the time of the morning that changed things, and I was good at it in the way you become good at something when it is the thing you are actually for. I met Sarah in 2012. She was a ceramicist. She had a studio in the River Arts District, and she made functional pottery and some sculptural work, and she approached the making of things with the specific conviction that objects held the attention of the hands that made them, and that this was not a small thing but was one of the ways people stayed connected to what was actual about their lives. She and I understood each other in the way of people who have both chosen work that does not announce itself, that requires presence and patience and the willingness to be in the same place repeatedly without expecting it to be different each time, and who recognize in each other the quality of someone who has made this choice deliberately. We married in 2015. Wren was born in 2016. Sarah died in April 2019. She was 34 years old, an undiagnosed long QT syndrome, a condition affecting the heart's electrical system that produces no symptoms until it produces a fatal arrhythmia. She was at home with Wren in the afternoon while I was leading a group on the Black Mountain Crest Trail. She was in the kitchen. Wren was in the living room. Sarah sat down and did not get up. Wren was 3 years old. I was not there. Wren called for her father on my phone. She had seen me unlock it enough times that she tried it, and it worked, because sometimes 3-year-olds do the impossible things. I came home to find my daughter had done the right things in a situation no 3-year-old should have to navigate. I had held her for a long time, and I had not said anything, and she had not said anything, and we had both understood, in the specific way that grief is understood before it is processed, that the world had changed in a permanent way. I tell you this because when I found Robert Bowen on the Laurel Mountain Connector Trail on October 16, 2021, the thing I knew most clearly was what it meant to be unreachable when someone needed you. I knew it from the inside, I knew what it cost, and I knew, crouching beside a man I had never met on a trail I walked every month, that I was not going to leave him alone. October 16, 2021 was a Saturday. I had led a group of 8 hikers on a half-day loop through the Avery Creek section of Pisgah that morning. A moderate trail, the kind I could lead in my sleep, the kind I had led dozens of times for groups of varying experience and enthusiasm. We had finished by noon. I had said goodbye to the group at the Avery Creek trailhead and had walked the connector trail back toward the Laurel Mountain parking area where my truck was. The connector trail was not heavily trafficked at that hour on that day. I had passed 2 hikers coming the other direction in the first half-mile, and then the trail had been mine. I found Robert Bowen at 12:18 p.m. He was face down on the trail, in the specific way of someone who had fallen forward rather than sat down. Not a trip, not a stumble, the forward fall of someone who had lost consciousness before they reached the ground. He was wearing good hiking clothes and good boots, and he had a small day pack, and he was 54 years old, which I did not know yet. I knelt beside him. I rolled him onto his back. I checked for pulse and breathing. There was no pulse. There was no breathing. I called 911. I told them what I had found and where I was, with the specific trail location and GPS coordinates I knew from 16 years of guiding in this forest. The dispatcher told me they were sending paramedics and to begin CPR. I began CPR. If you have not performed CPR on another human being, I want to tell you what it is, because the movies do not tell you accurately. It is physical, deeply physical, the specific compressions that require the full weight of your upper body applied at the correct rate on the center of another person's chest. It is not clean, and it is not quiet, and it does not have the orchestrated quality that screen versions give it. It is the specific brute force mechanical intervention of someone who has decided they are going to keep the blood moving in this person's body until someone with more resources arrives, and the only thing that matters is the rate and the depth and the not stopping. I did not stop. I performed compressions for 14 minutes. At 11 minutes, I know the timing because I was watching my phone clock, the specific habit of a guide who tracked time. Robert Bowen regained partial consciousness. This happens sometimes in cardiac arrest cases. A brief window, physiological rather than meaningful, a few seconds of awareness before the final loss. He opened his eyes. He looked at me. I said, "I've got you. Help is coming." He said something. It was quiet, not a whisper exactly, the specific quality of words that are being formed by a person who is using everything they have left to form them. 2 words. "Find her." I said, "I will." I did not know who he was. I did not know who she was. I said I will because it was the only thing I could say, and because I meant it in the way you mean things when you are crouching beside a stranger on a mountain trail, and the only thing that exists is the 2 of you and the words between you. He did not say anything else. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. Good time for the terrain. A response I knew was fast because I knew what the access looked like from the road. They took over compressions. They worked for 8 minutes. At 12:41 p.m. they made the determination. Deputy Adler arrived at 12:55 p.m. He was professional and thorough, and he took my statement with the specific quality of someone who understood that witnesses to traumatic events needed to be given time and space to give accurate information. I told him everything, including the 2 words. He wrote them down. He said they would be part of the record, from the personal effects, the driver's license, the phone, the watch. Deputy Adler identified Robert Bowen. He told me the name. He told me he was from Asheville. Before the deputy bagged the personal effects, I saw the watch. A Patek Philippe Calatrava. A specific Swiss watch, round, gold case, the specific kind of watch that is given rather than bought for oneself. The deputy had turned it to check the case back for identification marks. The inscription was visible from where I was standing. For Robert, with all my love. C. October 16th, 2000. I read it twice. October 16th, 2000. 21 years to the day. I drove home in the specific careful way you drive when something has happened that you have not yet fully processed. Present, attentive, not allowing the not yet processed thing to take up the space that the driving needed. I went home to Wren, who was with my mother Nora on a Saturday afternoon, and I held my daughter for a while without explaining why, which Nora understood and Wren accepted. And then I sat at the kitchen table when Wren was in bed, and I thought about 2 words for a long time. Find her. The detective work I did in the months that followed was not impressive. I am a trail guide. I know how to read terrain and weather and the specific signals that experienced hikers learn to read. I do not know how to find a billionaire pharmaceutical CEO who has been insulated from the ordinary channels of communication by the specific infrastructure that significant wealth constructs around its owners. I searched online. Robert Bowen Asheville architect produced immediate results. A firm, a portfolio, the biography of a man who had spent 25 years designing buildings that people used and remembered. I found that Robert was married to Catherine Bowen. I found that Catherine Bowen had founded Bowen Pharmaceuticals in 2001 and had built it into one of the more significant mid-size pharmaceutical companies in the Southeast. I tried to reach her. The first letter I sent in January 2022 went to the pharmaceutical company's public address. A careful letter, not melodramatic, explaining who I was and what had happened and what Robert had said. I received a form response acknowledging the condolence letter and thanking me for reaching out on behalf of the Bowen family. It had been cataloged as a condolence letter. Catherine had received hundreds. Mine had not reached her. I sent a second letter in June 2022. Same result. I did not know what else to do. I could not appear at the Bowen estate unannounced. I could not call the pharmaceutical company and say I had a message from Catherine Bowen's late husband. There was no mechanism in the ordinary world for what I was trying to do. So I went back to the trail. Not strategically, not with a plan for running into Catherine. I went back because the Laurel Mountain connector was part of my regular guiding territory and because I had made a promise on it and because being on it felt, in the specific irrational way that grief and obligation can make things feel, like the right place to be. I went back every month, in October, in the specific October approaching weeks when the light in Pisgah shifted to the quality it had on October 16th. I told Wren the story in pieces, not the medical details. She was 5 years old when Robert died and did not need those, but the shape of it, a man on a trail, 2 words, a promise her father had made and was keeping even when he didn't know how. She had been absorbing it for 2 years. She had the specific quality that children develop when they have been told true stories about serious things by a parent who trusts them to hold the truth. A quality of waiting, of understanding that certain things were still in progress and that she was part of the process. On the September Saturday when she found the watch in the leaf litter at the edge of the Laurel Mountain Trail, she picked it up with both hands and carried it to me with the specific gravity of a child who knows what she is holding even before she knows what she is holding. She said, "Daddy, look." I took the watch. I turned it over. I read the inscription on the case back. For Robert, with all my love. C. October 16th, 2000. I had read these words once before, 2 years ago, from 6 feet away on the trail while a deputy bagged evidence. I had been reading them in my memory ever since. I looked at my daughter. I said, "We need to find who this belongs to." She said, "Is it her?" I said, "I think so." She said, "Then let's go." We asked the only hiker below us on the trail, a man who had been coming down when we were going up, and he described the woman ahead of us. We moved fast. The trail curved upward toward the overlook, and we covered it in the specific, efficient way of two people who knew this forest and who understood that what they were looking for was above them. We found Catherine Bowen at the overlook, reaching for her chest and finding it empty. The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes. It did not feel like 40 minutes. It felt like the specific compression of time that happens when the thing you have been waiting for is finally happening, and your body understands that it cannot rush what is taking place. Catherine asked me to tell her about the 14 minutes. I told her, not with clinical detail, with the specific, honest account of someone who had been present for something and who was not going to diminish it by softening it or inflate it by dramatizing it. I told her what Robert had looked like when I found him. I told her what I had done and for how long. I told her about the 11-minute mark and what happened and what he had said. She listened with the complete stillness of a person receiving something they have needed for 2 years and did not know they were still waiting for. She said, "He was conscious." I said, "Briefly, a few seconds." She said, and he said, "Find her." I said, "Yes." She looked at the watch in her hand. She looked at the overlook, the specific view of Pisgah that spread below us, the mountains and the trees in the beginning of their turn, the quality of a landscape that was indifferent to what had happened on its trails and was therefore, paradoxically, the most honest witness to it. She said, "He came here every Saturday." I said, "I didn't know that." She said, "Since before we were married. He said the mountains were the place where he understood what he was supposed to build. He was an architect. He said he could see the shapes of things up here." She paused. He never wanted company on the Saturday hike. I used to tease him about it. I said he was just getting away from me. She smiled. It was the first smile, and it was the specific smile of someone accessing a memory that was painful and beloved simultaneously. She said, "He wasn't getting away. He was filling up, so he could come back." I said, "Yes." She said, "You know what that's like." I said, "I do." She looked at me. The quality of attention she brought was the specific quality of someone who had built a company and made difficult decisions for 20 years, and who knew how to look at a person and understand more than they were saying. She said, "You lost someone too." I said, "My wife, 2019. She said, "How?" I said, "A heart condition she didn't know she had." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Your daughter was very small." I said, 3. She looked at Wren, who had moved to the edge of the overlook and was looking out at the mountains with the specific quality of a child who is comfortable at altitude and who finds the view interesting rather than daunting. Catherine said, "She found the watch." I said, "Yes." She said, "Does she understand what she found?" I said, "She knows the story. I've been telling it to her in pieces since she was old enough to hold it." Catherine looked at my daughter for a long moment. Then she said, "What made you keep looking, after the letters didn't reach me?" I said, "I made a promise." She said, "To a man you had never met." I said, "To a man who needed to know someone was going to keep it." She looked at the watch. She looked at the inscription she knew by heart. She had written the words herself, 23 years ago, in a jewelry store in Asheville on an October afternoon, 21 years before Robert had died wearing it on a Saturday morning on the same mountain where she stood now. She said, "He would have liked you." I said, "I think I would have liked him." She said, "He was an honest person. He didn't perform things. What you saw was what was there." I said, "That's the quality I understood from him in those 2 words. She said, "How?" I said, "Because he didn't say goodbye. He said find her. He used the time he had to make sure something was going to happen. That's not a person who performs things." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've been wearing the watch for 2 years. On a chain because his wrist was too large for mine. I've been wearing it on every October walk and on the days when I needed to be close to something that was close to him." She paused. "The chain broke today." I said, "I know." She said, "On this trail." I said, "Yes." She said, "And your daughter found it in the leaves." I said, "Yes." She looked at me. There was something in the quality of her looking that I recognized. Not the specific recognition of shared experience, but the broader recognition of someone who is encountering something they do not have a complete framework for, and who is deciding in real time whether to extend the framework or to simply be present with what is happening. She said, "Mr. Greer." I said, "Owen." She said, "Owen, I don't know what to call what this is." I said, "I don't either." She said, "But I'm grateful for it." I said, "So am I." Wren came back from the overlook edge. She looked at Catherine. She said, "Did you know the man on the trail?" Catherine said, "He was my husband." Wren said, "Did he love the mountains?" Catherine said, "Very much." Wren thought about this. Then she said, "My dad loves the mountains too. He brings me up here so I can learn them." Catherine looked at me. She said, "Is that what you're doing?" I said, "Partly." She said, "What's the other part?" I said, "Keeping a promise." We walked down the trail together, Catherine and Wren and I, in the specific companionable way of three people who have arrived at a shared understanding and who do not need to fill the silence with anything because the silence is already full. At the trailhead, Catherine stood at her car and held the watch for a moment before putting it in her jacket pocket. Not the chain, the pocket, the direct contact of something held rather than hanging. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The two words. When he said them, was he in pain?" I had been asked this question in my mind many times in 2 years. I had thought about the honest answer many times. I had wanted the honest answer to be the right answer, and I had come to understand, over 2 years of thinking about it, that it was. I said, "No, he was not in pain. He was somewhere past pain. The two words were, they were the last thing that mattered to him. That was what his face said." She put her hand briefly over her pocket. She said, "Thank you." I said, "He told me to find you. I told him I would. It took 2 years and a broken chain, but I kept the promise." She said, "Yes, you did." She looked at Wren. She said, "Wren." Wren said, "Yes, ma'am." Catherine said, "You found something important today." Wren said, "I know." Catherine said, "How did you know?" Wren looked at the watch-shaped outline in Catherine's pocket. She said, "Because Daddy always said the thing we were looking for was on this trail, and we kept coming back." Catherine looked at my daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "She's remarkable." I said, "She has her mother's quality of attention." Catherine nodded. She got in her car. She drove away down the forest road in the September morning. We drove home to West Asheville in the truck. Wren was in the passenger seat. She was not a child who needed every silence filled, and she sat with the morning's events the way she sat with things that required a certain amount of interior processing before they were ready to be spoken. I had given her this, or rather, I had not taken it from her, which was perhaps more accurate. After a while, she said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Is the promise done now?" I thought about this. I thought about October 16th, 2021, and the 14 minutes on the trail, and the 2 words, and the 2 years of searching, and the September morning when a chain broke and a watch fell into the leaf litter and a 7-year-old girl picked it up with both hands and carried it to her father. I said, "The finding part is done." She said, "Is there another part?" I said, "I think there's always another part." She said, "What's this part?" I looked at the road. The French Broad River was visible through the trees as we came down out of the mountains and back toward the city. West Asheville in September. The specific quality of the place where I had always lived. The place that had held me through everything that had happened here and that was still holding me. Still simply present in the way of places that do not require anything of you except your continued presence in return. I said, "The part where you keep showing up, even when you don't know what you're showing up for." Wren thought about this. She said, "Like coming to the trail every month." I said, "Yes." She said, "Even when we didn't find her." I said, "Especially then." She said, "Why especially then?" I said, because showing up when you don't know what's going to happen is what makes the showing up mean anything. If you only come when you know it's going to work, it's not a promise. It's just a plan. Wren looked out the window at the French Broad River. She said, Mom would have liked her. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, Why do you say that? She said, Because she was honest. You can tell when someone is honest. Mom was honest like that. I said, Yes, she was. We drove the rest of the way home in the quiet that was not empty but was the specific full quiet of two people who have been somewhere that mattered and who are carrying it correctly. My mother, Nora, was in the house when we got back. She had come to spend Saturday afternoon with Wren the way she came every Saturday, the specific, reliable presence of a grandmother who had been holding the framework of our lives together since 2019 and who would continue doing so for as long as she was able and who we were both, in our different ways, deeply dependent on and deeply grateful for. She looked at us when we came in. She said, How was the trail? Wren said, We found a watch. Nora looked at me. I said, We found her. Nora said, The woman. I said, Yes. She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at me for a long moment in the way that mothers look at their children when something significant has happened and they are deciding how to respond to it. She said, Robert Bowen's wife. I said, Yes. She said, How? Wren said, The watch was on the ground and I found it and we went up the trail and she was there. Nora looked at Wren. She looked at me. She said, You kept going back. I said, Yes. She said, Every month? I said, Yes. She said, Owen. I said, Yeah. She said, Your grandfather would have done the same thing. She said it the way mothers say the things that matter most, simply, without ceremony, as a fact that did not need to be made into more than it was because it was already enough. I sat at the kitchen table with my mother and my daughter, and the September afternoon was outside the window doing what September afternoons did in Asheville, which was being entirely itself, the mountains in it, and the light on it, and the specific quality of a place that had been holding the people who lived here for a long time, and that was going to keep doing so. I thought about Robert Bowen on the trail. I thought about 2 words. I thought about what it meant to use your last available words to make sure something was going to happen, to point beyond yourself at the most specific possible moment toward the person who mattered most. I thought about Sarah in the kitchen in 2019. I thought about Wren in the leaf litter, holding up the watch with both hands. Some promises take 2 years to keep. Some promises are kept by a 7-year-old girl who has been told the truth in pieces and who knows what she is holding when she finds it because she has been paying attention. I had not been there when Sarah needed me. I had been there when Robert needed me. Wren had been there when Catherine needed her. The chain had broken on the right trail on the right morning, and the watch had fallen into the leaf litter, and my daughter had picked it up. The keeping of it mattered. That was what I wanted Wren to know. Not the specific story. She already knew the story. The quality underneath it. That you showed up on the trails even when you did not find what you were looking for, because the not finding was part of what made the finding real. Outside, the September mountains were doing what they always did. Being there, waiting for you to come back. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever kept a promise that took longer than you expected to keep? One where you didn't know if you were ever going to be able to keep it, but you kept showing up anyway? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is, and if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.